Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana, and we're here today with our special guest, Andy Karr, who's here to share with us his new book, Into the Mirror, a Buddhist journey through mind, matter, and the nature of reality. So Andy is a teacher, author, and photographer who offers profound and penetrating insights into Dharma and the mind. At an early age, he dreamed of becoming a Zen master, probably the result of reading Zen in the Art of Archery as a teenager. That led him to Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and the San Francisco Zen Center to train. He also trained in Boulder, Colorado. So let's welcome to the show, Andy Karr.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
What an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this book. I think the best place to start is with the title, Into the Mirror. What does that mean?
Well, I have to admit that for me, it was initially a mystery. The folks at Shambhala were pressing for a title, and I had gone through 5 or 6 of them that didn't quite work. And then one morning, when they were about to have their meeting for the group that decides on covers and titles, Into the Mirror came to mind. It actually took a few months before I had a sense of what that meant to me. And Into the Mirror represents a profound change of perspective. That normally we spend our lives running after reflections or running away from reflections, and there's this kind of endless cycle of dissatisfaction, of never being able to obtain what we really want. And the point of going into the mirror is to go into the mind that is doing all this wanting and fearing, and looking from a different place than we normally look, rather than the one who is chasing something or running away from something. It's the bigger space of just being and seeing that these appearances are like reflections.
What a great description. I really love that. And when we dive into your book, I mean, what is your book really about?
Well, it's about how we can take a deep, profound journey in an age that is extremely materialistic and not really that interested in the mind. So I think we all have a sense of the kind of consumerism that is continually surrounding us, all the efforts we make to try to get stature or even spiritual stature of some sort, and that there's some basic need that these things don't fulfill. And the reason they don't fulfill them is that we're always trying to obtain our mental image of something rather than the thing itself. We're trying to grasp at our own projections rather than anything that is truly meaningful. So, we might have the idea that a new phone, new car, a new lover might be the source of great happiness, of enduring happiness. And then when we obtain whatever we are seeking, we quickly discover that there are things we hadn't thought about the object, things we hadn't recognized, that we had just been looking at it in a very one-sided way. And we were really looking at our mental version of something rather than the thing itself. We were mistaking our image of something for something that had value in itself. And so there's always this pattern of craving and disappointment.
In your book, you share at a deeper level, materialism is about the nature of reality. And I'd love for you to expand on that for our listeners.
Sure. Well, this age that we live in is an age of materialism. And, it's got its wonderful side and its terrible side. To give you examples of these two, one of the wonderful things about this age is that science and technology and public health have doubled the human lifespan, not just in North America, but around the world. People are now living about twice as long as they did 100 years ago. And that's amazing. I mean, when you think about it, if the average lifespan today is around 80 years, it used to be around 40 years. So that's something to be really appreciative of. On the other hand, it's predicted that up to 1 million species of animals and plants will become extinct in the next few years because of our abuse of the resources of this planet. So science, technology, our forms of society have had tremendous impact in the way we live and on our environment. Some of them very good, some of them very bad, but they're fundamentally materialistic. They're treating the world as stuff. And because science and technology have been so successful and so powerful and had such great impact, we come to believe that everything is about stuff, that happiness comes from stuff, that unhappiness comes from stuff, that good stuff, bad stuff, that the mind that is appreciating all of this is kind of insignificant. So we'll say things like, oh, it's all in your head, meaning, whatever. You're just thinking that. The reality is this material stuff. So this kind of materialism has pervaded our culture. It pervades our philosophy, our scientific establishment. People think that the mind is a product of the brain rather than that the brain that we conceive of is a mental brain. If we think that the things that are described by science are the ultimately real things in the world, then what is it that knows all of this? So this kind of materialism puts mind in a subordinate or almost non-existent position. There are even philosophers who argue that mind is an illusion, which is particularly interesting because illusions are only known to minds. They're not known to atoms or molecules. So how could the mind be subsidiary to all these scientific models, which are fundamentally mental models? That's my riff on materialism.
A very good riff. Thank you for sharing that with us. Well, you start chapter number 1 talking about the Four Noble Truths. Why is that?
Well, that is the most fundamental insight of Buddhism, that there is this underlying level of dissatisfaction, suffering that we can't seem to get out of. Even in positive peak experiences, there's a subtle sense of, is this going to last? How do I hold on to this? There's some sort of struggle going on all the time. So the insight that Buddhism brings to this is that it's our craving and our attachment that cause this dissatisfaction. It's a mental factor that's causing us to continually wander in this painful way. And in particular, in the Mahayana Buddhism, which is the central focus of this book, we look very deeply into what this craving and attachment is about and see that they are these mental phenomena, these things that we are continually craving or attaching to are our versions of things. So that brings us to the third truth, which is the truth that you don't have to do this. You don't have to endlessly be trapped in this cycle of dissatisfaction, but there's a possibility of cessation, of letting go of the struggle at a very fundamental level. And then the fourth truth is that there's a path to that letting go, that it's not just something that happens to you, but it's something you cultivate. And you can cultivate it through developing insight, through developing contemplative mind, and through the kind of conduct that is of benefit to yourself and others.
Now, would that also go along the lines of attachment? Because it seems like we're so attached to many things that, in 10 years or in a year may not even work for us.
Sure.
So people are attached to their phones and cars and you name it.
Yeah, well, I'm still using a 5-year-old iPhone. So I guess I haven't had enough craving for a new one yet. But yeah, this does go for our attachments, that whatever we're attached to, at some point, we're going to have to part from. And whether we have to part from it because it wears out or we wear out, it's not going to last forever. But it seems like it will. So there's some disappointment down the road. And that's a mental thing. It's not going to be solved by having more stuff. There's no stuff that will make that okay.
I've often heard of that called like a black hole. We just keep filling it with things that never end. And it's always more, 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 more.
Yeah. The hedonic treadmill is another term that's used for that.
So in your book, you talk about the 3 trainings. What is that?
Well, the trainings are the way that we travel this path to freedom. And they are the trainings in meditation, the trainings in insight or knowledge, and the trainings in conduct. And each of these reinforces the other, so that the more insight we develop, the more effective our meditation is. The better our conduct, the easier it is to practice meditation and to study, and so on.
Well, it seems that there's so many different types of meditation out there. Is there kind of a core that we're looking for?
I would say there is. There are lots of different methods, but the basic method is to learn to just be with yourself. A lot of people, when they decide they want to learn to meditate, they find sitting alone for 10 or 15 minutes excruciating. I know in my own case, when I started to practice meditation, long periods of sitting I felt like I was going to jump out of my skull. So the first basic step is just learning to be with yourself, learning to accept that whatever goes on in your mind is not going to destroy you, that you can accommodate it and you can let it be, and you can be present with your experience. And then gradually, as you get more accustomed to being with yourself, being with your experience, accepting your experience, then you start to apply insight to that experience. So it's not just a matter of making peace with what you experience, but starting to look at its nature and starting to see how all the things that arise in your mind are somewhat dreamlike, that even though they seem to be momentous and critical and important and significant, that they come and go. And so often we're sitting and arguing with some dreamlike projection. Even though there's no one else around, we're remembering someone we fought with yesterday, and we sit on our cushion or on our chair. We're trying to meditate, and we find this inner dialogue going on with this imaginary person that has really no reality. That's what's happening in much of our life. It's becomes much more obvious when you don't have any other preoccupation other than just being with your experience. So those are really the two core elements of almost all Buddhist meditations. One is learning to make peace with whatever appears in your mind. And then the other is learning to look at what it actually is.
Well, I think I can relate with you on when I started meditating too. I'd sit on the cushion going, okay, I'm meditating. Oh my God, am I thinking? Oh shoot, do I have to start over? I mean, you get through all these things, your mind just keeps going. And is there a place that people who are starting can kind of be a little bit more gentle with themselves?
Well, absolutely. If you take the attitude that the purpose of meditation is to get rid of all the things that are coming up in your mind that are bothering you, it's going to be a long, hard slog. But if you take the attitude that the purpose of meditation is to make peace with whatever comes up, then it's going to go a lot better. There'll be times when you're very disturbed by your thoughts, and other times you're entertained by your thoughts. But gradually, the more you get into the habit of practicing this way, the more you can relax with whatever it is.
So we get to this point where we're really doing well in our meditation practice, whatever that looks like, and we start incorporating wisdom. So what would that look like?
Well, that's a really good question. The mind has so many different manifestations. There's so many things that appear: emotions, feelings, physical sensations, visual sensations, thoughts, on and on. So what it looks like is that these things become freer to come and go. You don't get stuck on them the way we normally do. You don't get so drawn into the little dramas that are appearing in your mind that you have no freedom, or there's no space around them. So I guess what happens is you start to recognize that there's a lot more space around these things than you initially thought.
So it's really developing that curiosity in some ways of what is going on around us.
Well said. Yes.
Well, you can tell I read your book, right?
Yeah, it's so much about, I think people misunderstand Buddhism at the beginning often and think that it's about pacifying things and getting rid of stuff. And it's so much more about recognizing what's already there and finding freedom right within all this confusion and whatever our difficulties in our life are, there's possibilities of freedom right within that rather than through getting rid of it. When you start to struggle with your experience, it's endless. You never win.
Yeah, I understand that that can be an ongoing thing, especially when we get into the path of suffering. And it's interesting that we can actually choose to look at suffering in a different way by shifting perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. It's even more than interesting, I would say. It's potentially liberating. But I want to qualify that by saying that this is not a simple journey. It's not like flicking a switch and changing your relationship to all of your experience. This is something that you gradually apply yourself to. And as you get more and more familiar with how things appear in your mind, how you work with them, then gradually things shift. Maybe even imperceptibly. Maybe it'll be years before you notice, wow, I'm experiencing things a bit differently. And then you fall back and you have some big neurotic upheaval and you think, oh God, I'm blowing it. I'm failing meditation. I'm failing Buddhism. And then you hopefully realize that that's just one of the little dramas that will occur on the path. So as someone who's spent a long time doing this, I would say that it will profoundly change your experience, change your life, but in a very, very gradual way. And the more you rush and the more you look for change, the more difficult it will be for it to happen. Suzuki Roshi, the great Zen master, said that enlightenment is not like getting wet in a thunderstorm. It's like getting wet in a fog. It happens very slowly, but when you get wet in a fog, you get really wet and it gets really hard to dry off.
What a great analogy. I like that. In your book, you talk about the subtle body, and I found that to be so interesting because it's something that I had not heard of in that way. And I would love for you to share that with our listeners.
Well, those teachings are very traditional in the Tibetan Buddhist path, but they're pretty esoteric and elusive usually. However, there's a contemporary Tibetan teacher, someone that I have tremendous respect for and have studied with, named Tsoknyi Rinpoche, who, when he was working first with Westerners, he grew up in Nepal, but started coming to the West about 25 years ago and teaching Westerners. And at first was amazed by how intelligent everyone was and how sharp intellects and how quickly everyone understood his teachings. And then gradually, after a few years, he realized that even though people's intellect was so sharp and we were so well trained just from our schooling, from the kind of intellectual backgrounds people brought to the teachings, that despite that, we weren't making a lot of progress. And he understood that this was caused by a lack of connection with our somatic experience, with our bodily experience, with feelings, with emotions, that we would so often get stuck in our heads that we wouldn't really be able to deal with a lot of underlying issues that were manifesting somatically. So he developed this practice, this subtle body practice that helps people drop out of the cognitive realm, out of the mental realm, the thought realm, into the feelings that they are experiencing. So, for example, you might have a little bit of anxiety. I'll give you a good example. Right before we started talking, I had a little upsurge in anxiety because I was going to be interviewed. And I always have a little bit of performance anxiety before speaking publicly. And I am pretty familiar with this feeling, but it took a while to learn that the dropping into this and feeling the feelings properly was much more effective than trying to suppress them or trying to tell myself it's okay, you'll do well, you've done this many times, blah, 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 blah. So this subtle body practice is a way of dealing with the things, the somatic things, the feeling things that appear, along with all the discursive thinking that we have. And this is a way of really touching in with that and working with our experience in a way that is non-conceptual, basically, and friendly and gentle, and is really transformative, a really wonderful way of working with feelings. So I encourage anyone who's interested in this to look up Sohni Rinpoche on the internet. The Pundarika Foundation is his organization, and you'll find a lot of teachings about the subtle body there that really outstanding and unusual, not something that a lot of people are teaching about, but I know I and many, many of my friends have found this very helpful.
That sounds like that would be a helpful exercise, because you do hear people talking about, oh, just stuff that into a little ball and keep going. And, people still deal with anxiety. I know I do sometimes.
Yeah, well, if you can really change the dynamic of anxiety, and it has to do with starting by changing your attitude. Rather than see it as a threat, see it as an opportunity to drop into your experience and relate directly with your feelings, and they will open up eventually.
Well, thank you for sharing that. There's so much profound wisdom in your book. This one kind of had me stop in my tracks. You talk about ego is a source of self-deception. And I love how you say it minimizes, overlooks, and makes excuses for our transgressions and faults while magnifying or demonizing the faults of others. Ooh, I can feel the burn on that one.
Me too. Yeah, that's such a challenge, isn't it? How to be honest with yourself about how you view others and how you view yourself. That's a big challenge. So, again, it's not something that we can turn around overnight, but it's worth noting. And I guess that highlights the importance of developing insight rather than trying to change what we are or who we are. Those things, you can try to just have nice thoughts about people and humble thoughts about yourself, but that is more like a Band-Aid approach than a real transformation. The real transformation, I think, comes about through acknowledging what your patterns are and maybe developing a little sense of humor about them. That would help a lot. And then relaxing more.
Or as your book says, the ego's perspective is fundamentally distorted. So keep that in mind as we're going throughout our day.
Yeah. Well, it's ego's perspective is fundamentally distorted, and ego itself is just a distortion. Ego is not a thing that really exists. It's a mistake. It's a mistaken way of perceiving your own being.
So, is there a way? And I know we're kind of there's so much in your book. I know we're only going to touch a very small portion of this today, but is there a way that we can overcome our sense of materialism?
Well, I think there is. It's difficult because our culture is so deeply imbued with materialism. So I would say that the starting point is to acknowledge how little lasting satisfaction comes from possessing stuff. That's really a good starting point. And then you can look further at this whole notion of what this stuff is, that, how it appears to you, why we take it as solid, lasting, important, valuable, and start to see how these are misperceptions about our experience. And then I think on another level, you can look into all of the narratives we have about the material world, how we think brains are the causes of minds. We think particles and forces are the causes of all the things we experience. And then look into what our actual experience of brains is, what our actual experience of particles and forces are. The more we look into this, the more we're going to recognize that it's always the mind that is coming into contact with whatever we think might be out there. We can never get beyond the horizon of our own minds. Now, it certainly makes sense to us that there must be something beyond that horizon. Otherwise, there wouldn't be the consistency of this seemingly solid external world. But the more we can recognize that that is a mental model of the world that may not actually be accurate, the less we're going to be bound by materialism. So one nice exercise is to think about how we see things, how things look to us. And we can imagine what they would look like to a creature with a very different sensory system. There's a very famous Western philosophy piece about what it's like to be a bat. Bats don't have visual systems the way humans have. They have a sensory system that is based on sound, like sonar. They make these clicking noises and listen for the reflections of these clicks. And that gives them a very detailed image of their environment. But if you think about it and you imagine what it would be like to be a bat, it's clear it's going to be so different. So then you have to ask, is our visual representation of the world the ultimate one? Is the bats an inferior one? Or are these just very different ways of navigating reality? So these kinds of thought experiments can really help us break down some of the conviction we have that we're seeing the world the way it really is and the way it must be.
You often hear of people that have seen an event and everyone can explain it so differently, regardless if they're there at that same present time in that same moment. And so it's interesting how perspective really is a driver for a lot of what it is that we feel.
Yeah, and the perspectives are so personal. The perspectives are based on our background, our relationships, all of this history. It's not just, oh, I see what's happening right now. It's how it fits into our worldview, our culture, our personal history, a lot of stuff we bring to the table that influence what we think we see.
Well, to dovetail with that, in your book, you talk about how we really are in two realities. And I'd love for you to expand on that for our listeners.
Yeah. Well, the way that that's often talked about in Mahayana Buddhism is that there are these two realities, the conventional reality or relative reality. There are different terms that are used for it, and genuine reality. And there's an interesting twist in this notion of relative reality or relative truth, as it's sometimes translated. The term that's used in both Sanskrit and Tibetan has this sense of not only reality as it's revealed, but also reality that conceals. So we have this ability, this cognitive ability to understand things, to understand how things work, to understand that if you do this, that will happen. If you do that, another thing will happen. That's a really useful and important understanding, but it also conceals something else. It conceals the nature of what's happening. So, give you an example. A map is a really useful device for navigating. If you want to go from here to there, and you use Google Maps or a paper map or whatever it is, it's really helpful. It will tell you what to do when, and you'll be able to arrive there. But the map is not the path, it's not the journey. If you spend too much time looking at the map, you might end up going off the road. Or you might end up making a journey where you don't really see your environment at all because it's concealed by this fixation on the map, on the details of when to turn, where to turn, and so on. So this notion of the two realities is that there's the reality of the map of our experience and then the reality of the experience itself. One is a relative or conventional reality, very useful, impossible to live without, but also concealing this genuine reality. So being able to distinguish maps from journeys is really important. Being able to distinguish these conventional truths from genuine reality is really important. And I guess this is going to go back to one of the things we started with in this conversation, which is, we are so often seeking something that we imagine to be a source of happiness. So that's like the map. We think this phone is going to have this capability and do that, and that'll be really good. And I'll be really happy with that. That's on the level of the map. The actual experience of having that phone is going to be different. We don't know in what ways it'll be different, but it'll be much more rich, detailed, ambiguous, challenging, sometimes frustrating. So the ability to recognize the difference between the conventional reality or the thought process, the narrative about reality, and the genuine reality itself helps free us from this confusion about sources of happiness and sources of suffering. Helps us find ways of living with whatever experiences come to us in a dignified and decent, healthy way. Get out of the cycle of craving and disappointment.
In your book, you talk about compassion. So how does compassion play a role in all of this?
Well, that's a really good one. This goes along with that training in conduct when we talked about the three trainings of training in meditation, training in insight or knowledge, and training in conduct. Compassion is extremely important as a training in conduct. First of all, it's going to get us out of our self-centeredness, which is a tremendously painful situation. There's a verse from a very old Buddhist text that says, all happiness comes from considering the welfare of others. All misery comes from considering your own welfare. It's not to say that you don't take care of yourself, but the more you are looking out for others and caring for them and concerned with them, the less self-absorption you have, the less fixation on your own needs and dissatisfactions. So at a very beginning level, compassion helps free us from that self-fixation. But it also goes a lot deeper than that, because even when we start to realize that so often we're dealing with our projections, our dream world, rather than genuine reality, we start to understand that other people are going through the same thing, and we want to help them deal with that. So the compassion at that point becomes more a project of helping others with their delusion rather than us worrying about our own. And then the ultimate form of compassion is what's known as non-referential compassion, or as Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche described it, radiation without a radiator. It's effortless warmth. So at all these three levels, compassion is of benefit to you, the person who's developing compassion, and beneficial to those you are around.
And so for our listeners today, what are some of the benefits of them really kind of getting into this practice and diving into this practice, and also just learning more about themselves from a Buddhist perspective?
Well, I think the biggest benefit is you can actually make friends with yourself. You can change your relationship to your world. Not like everything gets turned upside down and black becomes white and red becomes green, but more subtly. You can have a richer sense of your experience, a more healthy sense of your relationships. And in the long run, you can start to have real insight into the nature of experience and the nature of reality and what's really important in life. I don't want to overpromise. I don't want to make it sound like, oh yeah, take this pill and everything will be great. It's not like that, but it's something that that has great power, particularly if you're honest with yourself.
It's really a journey into self-exploration.
Yes.
Mm. Now, do you teach classes on this topic?
Sometimes I teach them whenever I'm invited to do that, pretty much. I have taught online a bit, which I'm less keen on, and I've traveled a bit to teach and teach in my hometown, Halifax, Nova Scotia.
So, Andy, where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your work?
You can learn about my work on andykarrauthor.com. That's my website, ANDYKARR, author. And you can connect with me personally through that site. There's a contact form on it. I don't really have a community. I travel in several different Buddhist communities and really enjoy meeting students of all sorts of different Buddhist communities.
Well, congratulations on the release of your new book. I know you've got upcoming events that people can go and attend and meet you at. Andy, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for this conversation. I enjoyed it. I hope our listeners enjoy it. And I think it's wonderful that you're doing these kinds of interviews. And thank you.
Well, thank you, Andy. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Into the Mirror, A Buddhist Journey Through Mind, Matter, and the Nature of Reality. Into the Mirror is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and everywhere books are sold. And remember, support our indie bookstores. If they don't have it on the shelf, just ask for them to order it. You can also purchase this book at the publisher Shambhala at shambhala.com. On that note, we're going to pause here for a quick moment, and we'll be right back after this message. I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.